Hello, my name's Shell. Welcome to my channel, and this is my January roundup of reading. I read 7 books this month. 2 were from my Historathon pile of possibilities, 2 were historical novels, 1 was a fantasy, and the last 2 were suspense novels. And I'd like to give a brief description of all of them in case it's something that you might like to read. The first book was called Plato and the Tyrant, and that was by James Rom. We read this back at the very beginning of January as part of a buddy read on the Historathon Discord server. I was pleased that it was a buddy read because a lot of the other people on there were much more knowledgeable than me, this being my first foray into Greek history and philosophy and really Plato. I didn't know anything much about any of them, but fortunately I don't think you really needed to get a lot out of this book. I never felt that I was lost. It's not really a lot about Plato's philosophy, although it does touch on that. It does give a brief description of Republic and some of the letters that he wrote, but mainly it's about visits he made, 3 visits that he made to Syracuse, Sicily, when he tried to really put his philosophical ideas into practice, and it didn't go very well for him. The book was split up into really 3 main parts, and the first part we looked at Dionysius, who was the tyrant of the title, and he was quite a spectacular tyrant. If half of what was written about him in this book was true, it would be quite horrific, but I get the impression there have been a lot of Chinese whispers down the years. But he was obviously a very paranoid tyrant, and he surrounded himself with yes men, and nobody would dare say anything against him. If you did, you were basically dead. And some of the things he did were quite outrageous. One of the things I found quite interesting was he had 2 wives. Well, he did have an original wife who unfortunately had a very horrific experience and she died. But then he got married to 2 women and had children, whole family with each one. And apparently in those days, because there was a rivalry then between the boys of each family as to who might take over after the dad has gone, the main idea was to marry the sons of one family off to the daughters of the other, so that then they were not only half brothers and sisters, they were all brothers and sister-in-laws. And in that way it would stop them fighting amongst each other, which I thought was quite funny. And I think that is, well, it must be true. They must have documentation of that somewhere. But he was a very interesting character, and I liked reading about him a lot. He was very, he was a very big character, very hedonistic as well, and he liked all his pleasures and his food and his parties. And I think Plato arriving there, trying to persuade him that it was much better to be fair and just and a better, kinder leader, didn't go down well, and he was kind of sent away with a flea in his ear. But whilst he was there, he met a character called Dion, and Dion was the brother-in-law of Dionysius, and they got on so well, and Dion really saw the worth of Plato's philosophy. And once Plato had gone home again and the old Dionysius had died and his son took over, I think Dion thought that this would be an easier target for Plato. But unfortunately, the son, the younger, Dionysius the younger, he really was just as hedonistic as his father. And I think he at first thought that he would listen to Plato. Plato did go back there for his second visit on Dion's request, but it didn't work out at all well, and he ended up going home again very upset. But after that, Dion really, he was thrown out of Syracuse for many years. I think it was almost 20 years that he was banished for. And then he decided that he would start a revolution and he would take Syracuse by force. Now, I'm not going to really say much about the rest of that because I did listen to a podcast with James Rom on The Ancients, which is one of the history hit groups of podcasts. And if you can find that, he really gives a lovely hour-long interview about this book. But when he gets to this point of the revolution, he says, I'm not going to say anything else about what's coming up because if you don't know, it would spoil it. And I'm so pleased he didn't, and that's why I'm not going to say anything more, because I didn't know anything about the revolution, and it went one way, it went another. There was so many betrayals and takeovers. It was fascinating. It was quite more like an action novel then, and I really enjoyed it. I think some people who knew a lot about this period already, I don't think they quite enjoyed it as much as I did, and they didn't quite like the way it was set out, but I did enjoy it thoroughly. And I think a good book leaves you wanting to know more, and I did come away wanting to know, particularly, funnily enough, more about the Carthaginians, because it was briefly mentioned that a lot of Carthaginians lived in Syracuse, and I wanted to know why and how they all came to live together, and how they got on. And I would like to know more about that, about these people. So if anybody can recommend a good book to get me started on Carthagin, I know it's a big time period, but I would like to, just a brief book just to get me started, if anybody can recommend anything. So that was the first book I read, and because we're reading, for Historathon, we're reading the Ancients. For the first 3 months, we're reading ancient history. So this fitted in perfectly, and it was a really good introduction. The second book I read in January was The Spinosaur Tales by David Hone and Mark P. Whitten. This was a great book. If you like dinosaurs, you're going to enjoy this. And it was quite different from the dinosaur books I've read before, because not a lot is known about the Spinosaurs. I think I did mention about this in my last video. These dinosaurs really only came to public attention in the third instalment of the Jurassic Park films. Nobody really knew much about them before then, but because they were so big and ferocious, they brought, I haven't seen it myself, but apparently they brought a Spinosaur in on the third film in the series, and they did make him quite a ferocious character. I thought, before reading this book, I thought that there hadn't been many of the Spinosaur fossils found outside Africa, but actually there have. And they described at the beginning of this book, which was written in 2024, they told you all the different places where just small bones have been found, because there's never been a big skeleton. And they've been found all over the world, in Japan, even in the UK, in America. The one they found in America they've called the Irritator, which I thought was a great name for a dinosaur. You could just imagine. So, they've never really found a whole skeleton. So, partly why I enjoyed this book was other books I've read on the dinosaurs. They've known a lot about the ones being discussed, about their lifestyle, what they ate, what they did, how they moved. But in this book, the authors were speculating from small fragments and bits of skeletons how they might have looked and how they might have moved. Most of the fossils that have been found have just been teeth, because apparently Spinosaurs shed their teeth every 70 days and get a whole new set, which I thought would be a great idea. Having had several visits to the dentist this year, I thought, why not? I can see where we're going wrong. But lots of these teeth have been found, and also bits of the tail. At first they thought that the skeleton was very solid, but later apparently that they found out that it was only that the hollowed out parts of the skeleton they found, I think it was a thigh bone that they found, that it was actually just been filled up with sediment which had gone solid, so it wasn't quite as dense as they suspected. And they had based a lot of theories around them being aquatic dinosaurs because of the density of these bones. Apparently they would need denser bones to be diving creatures, so they wouldn't be buoyant, and that's why they came to the conclusion that they were mainly water-living dinosaurs. But the authors of this book come out with the theory that they were more like waders that hung around the edge of the water and then just grabbed fish and various sea life as it went past. That's the theory that they have come. But even they say that they're not sure, they don't know, they're only speculating. But I really enjoyed this book. It is set out. First, they discuss the Spinosaurs and how they fit in to the rest of the dinosaur population. Then they go through what's known of the skeleton, parts that they've found. They discuss a chapter on the head, the body, and then a chapter on the tail area. And I just found it really fascinating. And I think if you like dinosaurs, it wasn't a hard book. If you're just interested in dinosaurs, it would be a good book to read. So now on to the novels that I read. The first one was a historical novel, and it was called Speaks the Nightbird by Robert R. McCammon. This is the first in the Matthew Corbett series, and this book came out in 2002, and I think there have been several more in this series since. We might be up to about book 8 now. I think this book will be in my 10 best novels of the year by the time we get to December, because I absolutely adored it. It was a long book. I read it on audio book and it was 30 hours long, so it was a long book, but there was no padding at all. It was just all story and I couldn't put it down. It's set in America in 1699, and Matthew Corbett is a trainee magistrate, and he's travelling with his boss to the Carolinas to a relatively new town that's been set up where a young woman has been accused of witchcraft. When they arrive, the magistrates that should have gone before them have disappeared, so they've been sent out as replacements. So the woman has already been in prison for about 6 months, awaiting a trial as to whether she should be burnt at the stake or not. And as soon as they got there, Matthew Corbett falls in love. He really does, and it's so sweet. But the whole town is against this poor woman, and I think it follows lots of witchcraft books of this type. It's all suspicion, and it is very difficult. A woman can't really argue against the accusations levelled against her, because if she says something right, then it's because the devil is speaking through her to convince people that she's good, and if she does something wrong, then the devil is speaking through her because she's evil. So there wasn't anything that she could do about it, and poor Matthew Corbett, he really was trying to find her innocent, but of course the whole village, there had been murders carried out there, and they wanted someone to blame, and she was an easy target because she had dark skin, which they were afraid of. But apart from the whole witchcraft story, it was very interesting, all about how these new towns were set up in those days, and the struggle of the people just to survive, and the mixture as well of all the different religions and the different races, people from all over the world trying to get along in these new towns, and it was a struggle for them to survive with this witchcraft story happening in their town. Lots of people were leaving, and that would mean that the town wouldn't be viable. So it was a lovely book. It was so well written, and I just can't wait to get on to the next one now. hopefully I'll be reading that, maybe not this month, but perhaps next month. The second historical novel I read was called The Household, and this was by Stacey Halls. I've read a couple of Stacey Halls books before, and I didn't think this one was quite as good as the other ones. One of her books was again about witchcraft. It was about the Witchfinder General in the Essex witch trials in the UK. But this one, it was set in the mid-19th century, and it was based on not true events, but a true... well, what had happened is that in those days, Charles Dickens had set up a house for fallen women, and they did have a record of a woman going from that house over to Australia, and they knew her name was Martha. So Stacey Halls had built the novel around that woman and this household. I quite enjoyed it. It was about a lot of the women had come straight from prison to this house, and it was about their relationships and the hardships that they endured before they got there. And also, one of the benefactors of the building was, her name was Angela, and she also had a stalker, which is very difficult in those days, as you can imagine. People didn't really take her seriously. And so the women helped her with her problem with this stalker, and she helped the women. She was a very kind lady. But a lot of it was just about their struggles, and they were learning to be ladies, maids, so that they could go over to the, well, I think they were going after Australia mostly, but to other Commonwealth countries they could go and work in the houses there. And that Charles Dickens didn't appear in the novel all that often. He was just a background character. In fact, we never actually saw him. We just heard about him from time to time. We heard he was coming for a visit or he'd been. But it was a very interesting idea, and I enjoyed it, but I think some of her earlier books were better. On to the fantasy book that I read. This was called The Strength of the Few, and it's by James Islington. This is the second in his Hierarchy series. I'm not really a fantasy reader, I'm quite new to fantasy. I did enjoy this, but I found it quite difficult to keep up with. His first book in this series was called The Will of the Many, and it was about a young man called Vis, and in this book we saw him attending an academy, and the academy was on an island, and on this island there were lots of, sort of artefacts of a bygone age when there had been a war. And I enjoyed the first book very much because we saw the build-up of his character and him learning all about what had happened to his own family and making his friendships, which lasted right through to the second book. So the first book kind of set the whole premise up. But in this second book, he went on, and his own character was split up into three. As a person, he was split up into three characters, and his three characters went to three different lands. One was based on ancient Egypt, one on ancient Rome, and one on ancient Ireland. And in these three different lands, we saw him having to learn and get involved in the politics, and he became much more of a hardened character. And he had, in all three of the lands, he had a terrible time. And it was very interesting, but I kind of found the names a bit difficult because they were all quite long and I was getting a bit confused. And the thing I'm not quite keen about the fantasy is that when it ended on a cliffhanger, and it's going to be a couple of years before the next one comes out. I read the first and the second one fairly close together, but it is going to be, by the time it gets to another 2 years hence, with this being so complicated, I'm not sure I'm going to remember. I have to read it again. But it was very interesting, and if you like fantasies, I'm sure you would enjoy that. Again, it was another long book. I think it was about 36 hours. So that's the end of the fantasy, and on to the suspense books. The first one was called The Girl in the Letter. Yes, this is by Emily Gunnis. This book was written in 2018, and it was a debut book, which I thought was very good for a debut novel. It was set in two time frames. It was one of those that goes backwards and forwards, and the older time frame was in 1956, about a girl called Ivy who had become pregnant by a footballer. And in those days, if the father didn't want to know, then you were really stuck. So her family sent her off to one of these convents where they basically stole the child away and gave it up for adoption. And the part of the book set in the future was about a lady called Sam Harper, and she was a journalist. Now, her grandmother had found some letters in her grandfather's office. Her grandfather had died, and in the office she'd found these letters. Now, he was an antiques dealer, so they thought they'd probably found these letters in some furniture that he got from, somewhere taken in, and he just kept the letters. And the letters were all from Ivy to her footballing boyfriend saying, please come and get me. This is our baby, we can be together. And they were quite heartbreaking, really. And Sam decided that she wanted to find out more about Ivy, and so she went to find the house where these nuns had set up their convent, and it was called St Margaret's. And when she got there, she found out it was going to be pulled down within a couple of days, so she only had a short amount of time to find out what had happened. I really liked the way we heard Ivy's voice through the letters. Every now and again a new letter was read out that the grandmother found and passed on, and it was really nice to hear her voice and the heartbreak that she went through. She did meet another young girl there who she decided to protect, and we got to find out what happened to the baby that she didn't give up, the baby that was taken from her. And it was a nice, gentle book, although it did have some heartbreaking parts in it. And I liked the way it went backwards and forwards in time. I didn't know until after I'd finished the book that Emily Gunnis is the daughter of Penny Vincenzi. I've read a few of her books in the past, although she's not my favourite author. She's certainly got big shoes to fill because her mother's very, very famous. I don't know if she's still writing. I don't even know if she's still with us, actually. I haven't seen a new book out from her for a long time. But Emily Gunnis has certainly written quite a few novels since this one. I think I saw 4 or 5 novels there. And I would read another one. It was, I'd like to know how she progresses as an author. On to my last book now. This is The House of Mirrors by Erin Kelly. She's written a lot of suspense novels, and I've read 2 or 3 and enjoyed them all. This is her most recent novel in 2024, so only a couple of years old. She did write the Broadchurch series, which was, I think it had about 7 seasons on the telly. I saw the first one, but I haven't seen any of the other ones. But I haven't read the books either. But this book is about a young girl called Alice who buys a vintage clothes shop in London. And she shows on her website every day an outfit of the day, and she's quite media savvy. And one day a woman comes into her shop and asks if she's Alice, and without wanting to say much else, she just hurries away. And Alice is left a bit baffled because she never gives out her name, because many years ago her dad was sent to prison for committing 2 murders. So they tend to keep a low profile so the press doesn't come round and want to do stories on them. Now, Alice has always been convinced that there was something funny about the murders, because she couldn't ever imagine her dad, such a loving person doing anything like that. So she's always trying to find out what happened. Shortly after the murders, her auntie committed suicide, although the body was never found. And she's always wondered if the aunt did actually die. She keeps trying to push her mother for information, and her mother won't ever tell her very much. She doesn't feel that she can talk to her about it. And the mother's a strange person. We're never quite sure what's going on with her. She's very possessive and she's very interfering. Alice has got a boyfriend called Gabe who seems to be the perfect partner, but for some reason her mum takes against him, and she's always trying to investigate to find out what he really wants, which really only ends up pushing the two of them closer together, and they decide that they're going to become civil partners. At the same time, we get to go back in time to find out bits and pieces about what happened at the time of the murder. I very much enjoyed this book, but I did find some of it a bit confusing, and I found out once I'd finished the whole book that it's a sequel. I didn't ever remember it saying anywhere that it was a sequel, but the first book in the series was called The Poison Tree, and I hadn't read that one, which I may go back and read it now. I have a feeling, although they said this was a standalone book, it could be read on its own, I have a feeling that I would have understood an awful lot more of what was going on if I'd have read the first book. There's a lot of references to Alice in Wonderland in this book. The character's called Alice after Alice in Wonderland, and a lot of the descriptions you can see go back to that book, that things to do with the mirrors, and there are lots of places where they've got checkered floorboards, and there are just so many references that if you know those books, that you will be able to see a lot of that in this story. It was good. I enjoyed it. Again, it wasn't my favourite of hers, but then perhaps that's my fault for not reading the first one. But perhaps I can put that right soon. Well, there are all the books that I read in January. I hope you found something in there that you might fancy reading. Again, if you can recommend any books to me, I very much like suspense and crime, historical and history books. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, if you've got any books about Carthage that you can recommend to me, more of an overall history, although I know it's a long period to cram into one book, I would really be very grateful for any recommendations. So that's all from me from this month. I look forward to watching all your January roundups, and I shall see you at the end of February, where I'm hoping to be able to talk about the books I'm going to read on Pompeii. Take care then. Bye.